The fire alarm went off during finals, but our teacher locked the door and said, "Nice try, but nobody's getting out of this test." I was halfway through question 17 on my AP chemistry final when the fire alarm started shrieking. The sound was so loud it made my teeth hurt, and everyone's heads snapped up from their exam papers at exactly the same moment. People started gathering their stuff automatically because we'd done this drill 100 times before. The protocol was simple. Leave everything except your phone and wallet, line up at the door, walk to the designated assembly area outside. Mrs. Garrison stood up from her desk at the front of the room and held up both hands like she was stopping traffic. She didn't head toward the door or reach for her emergency folder. Instead, she walked over and turned the deadbolt lock with this deliberate click that echoed even over the alarm. "Nice try, but nobody's getting out of this test," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. "Return to your seats immediately. You have 43 minutes remaining." I looked around at the other 26 students in the room, and everyone had the same confused expression. My friend Daniela, who sat 2 rows over, mouthed, "What the hell?" at me while pointing at the door. The alarm kept screaming, and Mrs. Garrison walked back to her desk like nothing unusual was happening. She sat down and started grading papers from another class, completely ignoring the sound that was making it impossible to think. A kid named Isaiah stood up near the back and said he was pretty sure we had to evacuate during fire alarms. Mrs. Garrison didn't even look up from her grading. Every single year, some student thinks they're clever and pulls the alarm during finals week. Last year it was during the AP biology exam, and the year before that it was during pre-calculus. I've been teaching for 19 years and I'm not falling for it anymore. You all stay right here and finish your tests. The alarm continued for another 30 seconds before cutting off abruptly, leaving this ringing silence in the room. But even without the noise, nobody moved to start working again. We were all just sitting there looking at each other and at the locked door and at Mrs. Garrison, who was acting like this was completely normal. I could see smoke coming under the door from the hallway. Just a thin gray line at first, barely visible against the tile floor. I thought maybe I was imagining it because my eyes were tired from staring at chemistry equations for an hour. But then Daniela stood up and pointed at it, and once she did, everyone could see it. The smoke was getting thicker, turning from gray to darker gray, creeping across the floor like fog. "Mrs. Garrison," Daniela said, her voice getting higher. "There's smoke. We need to leave right now." Mrs. Garrison finally looked up from her papers, squinting at the door like she needed glasses but refused to admit it. She stood and walked over, bending down to look at the smoke, then straightened up and waved her hand dismissively. "It's probably from someone vaping in the bathroom. You know how the ventilation system pulls air through the hallways. Everyone sit down and get back to work. You're wasting precious test time with this nonsense." But the smoke kept coming, and now I could smell something burning. Not like paper or wood, but something chemical and sharp that made my throat feel tight. Isaiah walked toward the door despite Mrs. Garrison's order, and 3 other students followed him. They tried the handle, but it didn't budge because she'd locked it. Isaiah turned around and said they needed the key, and Mrs. Garrison crossed her arms and shook her head. "You'll get the key when the test time is up, not 1 second before. I'm not going to let you all cheat by looking up answers on your phones during a fake fire drill. Now sit down." That's when the second alarm started, except this one was different. It wasn't the fire alarm with its steady wailing. This was the lockdown alarm, the one that meant active threat, the one we drilled for after the shooting at the school 3 counties over last fall. The sound was this pulsing tone that made my whole body tense up, and a recorded voice came over the intercom saying, "Lockdown initiated. This is not a drill. All teachers secure your classrooms immediately." Everyone started talking at once, voices overlapping in confusion and fear. Half the class stood up and moved toward the windows, which were those old-fashioned kind that actually opened. Mrs. Garrison's face went from annoyed to confused for just a second, but then she set her jaw and said louder, "Everyone in your seats now. I don't care what the intercom says. This is clearly students coordinating to disrupt finals. Sit down or you'll receive a 0 on this exam." The smoke was now thick enough that the far corner of the room was getting hazy. I could hear something in the hallway, footsteps running and someone yelling, but I couldn't make out the words through the door. My phone buzzed in my pocket, which shouldn't have been possible because we'd all turned them off for the test. I pulled it out and saw 15 missed calls from my mom and a text that just said, "Fire at school, get out now, news says whole building." I held up my phone to show Mrs. Garrison. "My mom says there's a real fire. It's on the news. We need to leave right now." She walked over and snatched the phone from my hand, looking at the screen with narrowed eyes. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd finally believe us, but instead she powered it off and set it on her desk. "Clever, using your mother to try to convince me. But I'm not naive. You probably sent yourself that text before the exam started. Scheduled it to arrive during the test. Everyone's phones go on my desk immediately. This test continues." Daniela started crying, which made this situation feel even more unreal because Daniela never cried. She was the girl who'd broken her arm during soccer practice and walked to the nurse's office without making a sound. Now tears were running down her face as she stared at the smoke that was maybe 3 inches thick across the floor. Another student, a quiet kid named Warren who I'd never heard speak in class, suddenly stood up and grabbed his backpack. "I'm leaving. My dad's a firefighter and he always said if you see smoke, you go. I don't care about the test." Mrs. Garrison moved to block the door, spreading her arms wide like she could physically stop all 27 of us. "Warren Liu, if you take one more step toward this door, you will fail this class. Not just the exam, the entire semester. Do you understand me? Sit down right now." Warren stopped, and I could see him calculating whether graduating was worth potentially dying. The smoke chose that moment to trigger the sprinkler system. Water started raining down from the ceiling, immediately soaking all our test papers and making the ink run. Students screamed and tried to cover their exams with their bodies, but it was pointless. Within seconds, everything was drenched. Mrs. Garrison looked up at the sprinklers with this expression of betrayal, like they'd personally attacked her. She grabbed the emergency towel from her desk drawer and tried to dry off her gradebook, but it was already ruined. The water was cold, and the pressure was intense, like standing under a shower set to maximum. My clothes were plastered to my body, and my test paper had turned into a soggy mess that was disintegrating under my pencil. Through the windows, I could now see actual flames. Not in our room, but in the building across the courtyard. The science wing was on fire, with orange flames visible through third-floor windows and black smoke pouring out. The courtyard below was full of students who'd evacuated, all standing behind yellow tape that security must have put up. We could see them pointing up at our window, and some were holding phones up recording. Mrs. Garrison finally looked out the window, and her face went pale. The fire across the courtyard was growing, spreading from one window to the next, and we could hear glass breaking even through our closed windows. She stood there frozen for maybe 5 seconds, just staring at the flames. Then she pulled herself together and walked to the door, taking her keyring from her pocket. "All right, everyone line up single file. We're evacuating in an orderly fashion. No running, no pushing. Leave your tests on your desks." The door wouldn't open. She turned the key and pulled the handle, but something was wrong. She tried again, jiggling the key and pulling harder, but the door stayed shut. Isaiah pushed forward to help, and together they yanked on the handle while the smoke in the hallway got darker and started coming under the door in thick rolling clouds. "It's jammed," Mrs. Garrison said, and her voice cracked on the word jammed. "Something's blocking it from the outside. The heat must have warped the frame." That's when I realized we weren't just locked in by her stupid paranoia about cheating. We were actually trapped. The smoke was filling the room now, hanging at chest height and dropping lower with each second. Students started coughing, and the sprinklers continued dumping water on us. Through the window, the fire across the courtyard was fully engulfed, and I could see firefighters arriving with trucks and hoses, but they were focused on that building, not ours. They didn't know we were trapped in here. Daniela ran to the windows and started pulling on them, trying to open them wider. They were the crank style that only opened about 6 inches, not nearly enough for a person to fit through. She grabbed a chair and looked like she was about to throw it through the glass, but Mrs. Garrison screamed at her to stop. "That glass is expensive and we're on the 2nd floor. You'll kill yourself jumping from this height. Everyone stay calm while I figure this out." Warren pulled out his phone, which he'd hidden in his sock instead of putting on Mrs. Garrison's desk. He was trying to call 911, but kept shaking his head. No signal. The fire must have taken out a cell tower or something. I can't get through. The smoke was at our shoulders now, forcing us to crouch down to breathe. The air near the floor was slightly better, but not by much. My eyes were burning and my throat felt like I'd swallowed sandpaper. Around me, students were coughing violently, and a girl named Patricia threw up in the corner from the smoke inhalation. Mrs. Garrison was on her hands and knees at the door, still trying to force it open. She'd grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and was using it like a battering ram, slamming it against the door frame over and over. But the door was solid wood and the frame wasn't budging. I could see tears mixing with the sprinkler water on her face, and she kept saying, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry," between hits. Isaiah and 3 other guys joined her, all of them throwing their weight against the door. They counted down together and hit it simultaneously, and I heard something crack. Not the door, but the wall next to it. The drywall had split from the impact, creating a small hole about the size of a baseball. Warren immediately started kicking at the hole, making it bigger. The drywall crumbled more easily than the door, and within a minute they'd created an opening large enough to see into the hallway. Smoke poured through the hole, thick and black, and through it I could see flames. The hallway was on fire. Not just smoke anymore, but actual flames running along the ceiling and down the walls. The lockers were glowing red from the heat, and I could see melted plastic dripping from the ceiling tiles. The door wasn't jammed because of warped wood. It was jammed because the hallway was completely impassable. Mrs. Garrison pulled back from the hole, her face covered in soot and her eyes wide. She looked at all of us crouched on the floor, soaking wet from the sprinklers, breathing smoke, and I saw the exact moment she realized what she'd done. She'd locked us in here during a real emergency. Her paranoia about test cheating had trapped us in a room that was filling with smoke while fire raged in the hallway outside. There was no way out through the door. The windows were too small. We were on the 2nd floor, too high to jump safely, and the firefighters outside were focused on the other building. Nobody knew we were here. Daniela stood up despite the smoke and faced Mrs. Garrison directly. "This is your fault. You did this. If we die in here, it's because you locked that door." Mrs. Garrison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked around at all of us like she was seeing us for the first time, not as potential cheaters or grade statistics, but as actual human beings who were in danger because of her choices. She turned and grabbed the classroom phone from the wall, punching in numbers, but the line was dead, probably because the fire had damaged the infrastructure. She slammed the phone down and turned to the windows. "We have to break them. It's the only way to signal for help and get fresh air. The fall won't kill you if you hang from the ledge and drop. It's only about 10 feet that way." Isaiah grabbed the chair Daniela had been holding earlier and swung it at the window. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break. He swung again, and this time, the window shattered outward in a shower of glass. Fresh air rushed in, and we could hear sirens and people shouting below. Warren leaned out the broken window and started yelling, waving his arms to get the firefighters' attention. Students crowded around the windows, trying to breathe the outside air while avoiding the broken glass still stuck in the frame. Below us in the courtyard, people were pointing up at our room now. I could see firefighters turning their hoses toward our building, finally noticing that the fire had spread from the science wing to the humanities building where we were trapped. But the smoke was getting worse, not better. Even with the window broken, the smoke from the hallway was overwhelming the fresh air. We were all coughing constantly now, and Patricia had passed out in the corner. 2 students were dragging her to the window, trying to get her closer to the fresh air. Mrs. Garrison was helping them, her earlier authority completely gone, replaced by desperate guilt. Through the broken window, I could see a fire truck positioning a ladder. But it was moving so slowly, the hydraulics raising the ladder foot by foot while smoke poured out of our window. The firefighters were shouting something through megaphones, but I couldn't understand them over the sound of the fire and the sprinklers and everyone coughing and crying. Isaiah didn't wait for the ladder. He cleared the remaining glass from the window frame with his jacket wrapped around his hand, then sat on the ledge with his legs hanging outside. Mrs. Garrison grabbed his shoulder and tried to pull him back, but he shrugged her off. "I'm not dying in here because you're worried about liability. I'm jumping." He turned around so he was facing into the room, holding the window frame with both hands. Then he lowered himself until he was hanging from the ledge by his fingertips, his feet dangling maybe 12 feet above the ground. He looked up at us one last time, said, "See you on the ground," and let go. I watched him fall, his arms windmilling as he tried to control his descent. He hit the wet grass and rolled, and for a horrible second I thought he'd broken something. But then he stood up, limping but upright, and gave us a thumbs up before security guards rushed over to pull him away from the building. That broke the dam. 3 more students immediately lined up at the window, preparing to follow Isaiah's lead. Mrs. Garrison tried to stop them, grabbing arms and saying the ladder was almost here, but they ignored her. One after another, they dropped from the window, some landing better than others. A girl named Keisha landed hard on her ankle and had to be carried away by 2 firefighters. Warren made it down without injury and immediately started helping the firefighters position their ladder toward our window. The ladder finally reached our window after 7 students had already jumped. A firefighter in full gear climbed up and poked his head through the broken frame, his breathing apparatus making him look alien. He assessed the situation, saw the smoke-filled room and the remaining students, and started barking orders. One at a time onto the ladder. Fastest way down is going to be me carrying the smaller students. Anyone who can climb on their own, go now. Daniela went first, climbing down the ladder with shaking hands while the firefighter stayed at the top to help. Behind her, a steady stream of students descended, some on their own, others being carried by firefighters who climbed up just to bring them down. Patricia was still unconscious, and it took 2 firefighters to get her onto a stretcher and lower her down the ladder. I was near the back of the line, waiting my turn while the smoke got thicker. The sprinklers had finally stopped, probably because the water main had been damaged by the fire. Without the water, the heat in the room was becoming unbearable. The wall that separated us from the burning hallway was hot to the touch, and I could see the paint bubbling. There were 6 of us left in the room when the wall caught fire. Not slowly, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. Flames erupted from the drywall, spreading across the classroom ceiling in seconds. The firefighter at the window grabbed the nearest student and literally threw them onto the ladder, then reached for the next person. I was third in line, and I could feel the heat on my back as the fire spread behind me. The ceiling tiles were dripping burning material, and the posters on the walls curled and blackened. Mrs. Garrison was last. She pushed the student in front of me toward the window and shouted at the firefighter to take them first. I was right at the window frame, ready to climb onto the ladder, when I heard her scream. I turned around and saw that her jacket had caught fire from a falling ceiling tile. She was slapping at it, trying to put it out, but the flames were spreading across her back. The firefighter reached past me and grabbed her, pulling her toward the window. But she fought him, trying to push him away because she thought he should save me first. He ignored her protests and dragged her to the window, shoving her onto the ladder where another firefighter was waiting. They descended quickly, leaving me alone in the burning room. The heat was incredible now, like standing inside an oven. My hair felt like it was about to catch fire, and I couldn't see more than a foot in front of me through the smoke. The firefighter appeared back at the window, silhouetted by the light from outside, and reached for me. I grabbed his hand, and he pulled me through the window frame so hard I felt my ribs compress. He turned me around and put me on the ladder, then climbed down behind me with one hand on my back to keep me from falling. The descent took maybe 20 seconds, but it felt like forever. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the rungs, and twice I missed my footing and almost fell before the firefighter caught me. When my feet finally hit the ground, my legs gave out and I collapsed onto the grass. Paramedics were everywhere, putting oxygen masks on students and checking for injuries. I could see Mrs. Garrison being loaded into an ambulance, her jacket still smoking. The burn on her back looked bad, but she was conscious and talking to the paramedics. Around me, students were crying or sitting in shock or calling their parents. The fire had spread through most of the humanities building now, and firefighters had given up on saving the structure. They were just trying to keep it from spreading to other buildings. I watched the window we'd escaped from get swallowed by flames, and the entire 3rd floor collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. If we'd waited even 2 more minutes, none of us would have made it out. Daniela found me sitting on the grass and dropped down next to me, pulling me into a hug. We just sat there shaking and breathing and being alive. Around us, the chaos continued. Fire trucks and ambulances and news crews setting up cameras. A reporter tried to shove a microphone in my face, asking what it was like being trapped in there, but a firefighter physically moved her away before I could answer. My mom arrived 30 minutes later, running across the courtyard and crying so hard she couldn't speak. She just grabbed me and held on, checking me over for injuries like I was 5 years old instead of 17. My dad showed up right behind her, and he was crying too, which I'd never seen before in my entire life. They took me to the hospital even though I said I was fine. The doctor said I had smoke inhalation and needed to stay overnight for observation. They put me in a room with Daniela and Warren, and we just watched the news coverage in silence. The fire had started in a chemistry lab where a student was working on an experiment without supervision. A reaction had gone wrong, causing an explosion that ignited chemicals and quickly spread to the rest of the science wing. The fire department estimated that the flames had spread to the humanities building within 6 minutes of the initial explosion. They showed aerial footage of the damage, and I counted 5 buildings that had been partially or completely destroyed. The death toll was being updated constantly, and every time they added a number, my stomach dropped. The reporter said that 1 teacher and 3 students were still unaccounted for, and I wondered if they'd been in rooms like ours, trapped by circumstances or bad decisions. The next morning, a different reporter did a whole segment about Mrs. Garrison. They'd interviewed students who'd escaped, and the story had gotten out about her locking the door during the fire alarm. The reporter called her reckless and negligent, and showed dramatic reenactments of us trapped in the smoke-filled room. But they also interviewed Isaiah, who said that despite her terrible judgment, she'd ultimately tried to save us at the end and had gotten burned doing it. The news played footage of her being loaded into the ambulance, and I could see the guilty expression on her face even through the smoke and chaos. The internet had already decided she was a villain. There were hashtags calling for her teaching license to be revoked, and someone had started a petition to press criminal charges. Parents were giving interviews saying she should go to prison for endangering students, but none of them had been there in that room, hadn't seen her face when she realized what she'd done, hadn't watched her push students out the window before herself even as the fire caught her jacket. My mom wanted me to give an interview, to tell my side of the story, but I couldn't. What would I even say? That Mrs. Garrison made a horrible choice that almost killed us, but that she wasn't actually a monster? That she'd spent 19 years teaching and this one mistake was going to define her entire career? That I was angry at her but also felt bad for her? None of that fit into a neat soundbite that would satisfy the internet's hunger for villains. The school was closed for the rest of the semester while they investigated and assessed the damage. We all had to take our finals remotely from home, which felt absurdly anticlimactic after everything that happened. I sat at my desk in my bedroom, taking the chemistry final on my laptop, and kept thinking about the original test paper disintegrating under the sprinklers. I got a B on the makeup exam, which was better than I deserved given that I couldn't focus on any of the questions. 3 students died in the fire, 2 in the chemistry lab where it started, killed instantly by the explosion. 1 more in a bathroom on the 3rd floor of the science wing, overcome by smoke before firefighters could reach them. Mrs. Garrison's door-locking decision hadn't killed anyone directly, but it had put 27 students in serious danger, and several of us had injuries from the smoke or from jumping out the window. The district placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation. Her teaching license was suspended, and there were discussions about pressing criminal charges, though the district attorney said that would be difficult to prove, given that she eventually tried to help us escape. I saw her one more time before the end of the school year. She was at the grocery store with her arm in a sling from the burns, looking at tomatoes like they contained the answers to the universe. She saw me at the same moment I saw her, and we both froze. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the produce section. Then she walked over, moving slowly, like she was approaching a dangerous animal. "I'm sorry," she said, and her voice was hoarse, probably from smoke damage. "I know that's not enough, and nothing I can say will make it better. But I need you to know I'm sorry, and I think about what I did every single day." I didn't know what to say back. Part of me wanted to scream at her, to tell her that she'd traumatized 27 teenagers because she was paranoid about test cheating. But looking at her standing there with her burns and her sling and her obvious guilt, I couldn't find the anger anymore. I just felt tired. "Okay," I said finally. "I believe you're sorry. But that doesn't change what happened." She nodded like she'd expected that answer, maybe even hoped for it because it would be easier than forgiveness. We stood there for another awkward moment before she turned and walked away, leaving her shopping cart behind. I never saw her again after that. The school district didn't renew her contract, which was their way of firing her without actually firing her. She moved out of town that summer, and I heard from someone that she'd gotten a job in retail, completely leaving teaching behind. The school year ended remotely, and graduation was a strange, subdued ceremony held in a parking lot with everyone wearing masks and maintaining distance. Our class had been planning for 4 years to celebrate together, but instead, we received our diplomas one at a time while our families watched from their cars. The principal gave a speech about resilience and overcoming tragedy, but it felt hollow. We hadn't overcome anything. We'd just survived. Daniela and Warren and I ended up going to the same college, not because we'd planned it, but because we couldn't imagine being separated after what we'd been through. We had an unspoken understanding that nobody else would get what it was like to be trapped in that room, watching the smoke rise while a teacher's paranoia kept us locked inside. We became the kind of friends who didn't need to explain things, who could look at each other during a fire drill and know exactly what the other was thinking. The nightmares started about a month after the fire. I'd dreamed that I was back in that classroom with the smoke rising and the door locked, but in the dreams, the firefighters never came. I'd wake up gasping, my chest tight, convinced I could smell smoke even though my dorm room was perfectly safe. My roommate freshman year was understanding at first, but after the 3rd time I woke him up screaming, he requested a room change. I didn't blame him. I started seeing a therapist at the campus counseling center, a woman named Dr. Nina Reeves, who specialized in trauma. She had me do these exercises where I'd visualize the classroom but change the ending. Imagine myself calmly walking out through an unlocked door. It helped sometimes, but other times the exercises just made me relive everything more vividly. She explained that I had PTSD and that it might take years to fully process what had happened. Years. The idea that I'd be dealing with this for years made me want to give up therapy entirely, but I kept going because the alternative was letting the fire define the rest of my life, and I refused to give it that power. By sophomore year, the nightmares had decreased to maybe once a month instead of every week. I could sit through fire drills without panicking, though I always made sure I was near an exit and knew exactly how to get out. I started taking education classes because I'd decided I wanted to be a teacher, specifically a chemistry teacher. Dr. Reeves said this was my way of reclaiming the narrative, of taking something traumatic and turning it into purpose. Maybe she was right. Or maybe I just wanted to prove that teachers could make better choices than Mrs. Garrison had made. The summer after my junior year, I did a teaching internship at a high school summer program. On my first day, the fire alarm went off during a lab session. It was just a drill, but my body didn't know that. My heart rate spiked and my hands started shaking, and for a moment I couldn't move. But then I looked at the 15 students staring at me, waiting to see what I'd do. I took a breath, unlocked the classroom door, and led them outside in a calm, orderly line. We stood in the parking lot until the all-clear was given, and none of those students knew that I'd just overcome something huge. But I knew, and that was enough. I graduated with my teaching degree and got hired at a school district 2 states away from where I grew up, far enough that nobody knew my history unless I chose to tell them. My first semester teaching was exactly as chaotic and overwhelming as everyone said it would be. I had 130 students across 5 classes, and I spent every evening grading papers and planning lessons and wondering if I was doing anything right. But during fire drills, I was always the teacher who got my students out the fastest. I never, not even once, considered that an alarm might be fake or treated safety protocols like they were inconvenient. My students probably thought I was paranoid, the way I practiced evacuation routes and made them memorize emergency procedures. But I didn't care. In my 3rd year of teaching, I was eating lunch in the faculty lounge when another teacher mentioned a former colleague who'd lost her license after locking students in during a fire. It took me a moment to realize she was talking about Mrs. Garrison. The story had become an urban legend in education circles, a cautionary tale they told in teaching programs about the importance of following safety protocols. But in the retelling, Mrs. Garrison had become a monster, someone who deliberately tried to harm students. The nuance was gone. Nobody mentioned that she'd been paranoid about cheating, or that she'd eventually tried to save us, or that she'd gotten burned in the process. She was just the villain in a story about what not to do. I wanted to correct the story, to add the context, but I didn't. Because the truth was complicated and people didn't want complicated. They wanted clear heroes and villains, obvious lessons and tidy endings. And Mrs. Garrison's story didn't fit that template. After 15 years of teaching, I still think about that day in the locked classroom. I think about it every time there's a fire drill, every time I see smoke, every time a student tries to convince me of something that sounds too convenient to be true. I think about Mrs. Garrison and wonder what happened to her, whether she ever forgave herself for what she did. I think about Isaiah hanging from the window ledge, and Daniela breaking down crying, and Patricia unconscious in the corner. I think about the 3 students who died in rooms where teachers had followed the rules and evacuated properly, and I wonder about the randomness of survival. But mostly, I think about the moment when Mrs. Garrison finally understood that the alarm was real. The look on her face when she realized her paranoia had put us all in danger. That moment of horrified comprehension that her choices had consequences she never intended. I think about it because it reminds me that teaching isn't just about lesson plans and test scores. It's about making dozens of small decisions every day, and any one of them could be the difference between students who make it home safely and students who don't. It's about trusting that alarms are real even when they might be fake. It's about accepting that sometimes you can't prevent cheating, but you can prevent tragedy. My students will never know why I'm the teacher who takes fire drills so seriously, why I refuse to lock my classroom door during tests, why I have 3 different emergency exit plans posted around the room. They'll never know about the fire or Mrs. Garrison or what it feels like to watch smoke rise while you're trapped inside. And that's okay, because every student who walks out of my classroom safely, every fire drill where we evacuate without incident, every test where someone could cheat but I don't lock the door anyway, that's me making a different choice than Mrs. Garrison made. That's me choosing to trust the alarms and protect the students, even if it costs me perfect test security. Some of my students probably do cheat. I'm not naive enough to think they don't. But I'd rather have students who cheat and live than students who are honest and trapped. That's the lesson I learned in that smoke-filled room, and it's the lesson I carry with me every single day I teach. The fire alarm goes off during my finals now, and I don't hesitate. I unlock the door, I lead my students outside, and I count heads to make sure everyone made it. And if it turns out to be a false alarm pulled by a student trying to avoid a test, well, that's a problem I can solve later. Because the alternative, the locked door and the rising smoke and the trapped students, that's not a problem anyone should ever have to solve. Standing outside during drills, watching my students joke around and complain about the interruption, I sometimes catch myself looking at the windows of our classroom. 2nd floor, too high to jump safely, with windows that only crank open 6 inches. And I think about how different choices, made in a single moment of paranoia and pride, can mean the difference between students who graduate and students who become statistics. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.